Because they're so story-heavy, fairy tales are something that I naturally gravitate towards, and I'm always fascinated to see how different writers will take such different approaches to them. In the case of Moulin Rouge, for example, Baz Luhrmann chose the strategy of fusing the real world with the fantasy world, and both of those dimensions interacted with one another harmoniously. In the case of Pan's Labyrinth, Guillermo del Toro chose the exact opposite strategy. In this film, the real world and the fantasy world are completely opposed to one another, and with the possible exception of the ending, they never interact whatsoever. In fact, it took me a while upon seeing this for the first time to realize that what Del Toro was doing with Pan's Labyrinth was essentially showing me two completely different movies in the same breath. One movie deals with a fantasy story with a fantasy world. The other deals with a story that is as real as it gets. It is a war story, a story of totalitarianism, oppression, and infiltration. You could actually separate these two aspects of the film, play them independent of one another, and have two perfectly functioning films on their own. But putting them together culminates into one of the most unique and most breathtaking films I have ever seen. Also here again is another good example of a filmmaker taking elements from other works, but making them his own, rather than simply repeating a formula. Del Toro has acknowledged the similarities between Pan's Labyrinth and other works, such as the Chronicles of Narnia. Both are set around the same time, under the same circumstances of a family forced to relocate due to a war-torn time and place. Both have similar themes of disobedience and choice, and both contain similar mythical creatures, the most obvious of which are fauns. Del Toro's response to this in his own words were that this is his version of that universe, not only the Narnia universe, but the universe of children's literature in general. Pan's Labyrinth's influences are certainly obvious, but like Moulin Rouge, it does not simply parrot those influences back to you. Del Toro takes very familiar tools and creates something original out of them. This is not the Chronicles of Narnia. In fact, in many ways for me, it surpasses Narnia in every measurable sense. Just as with Moulin Rouge, this film begins at the end, with the death of Ophelia, the primary character in the film. After this, we are told a tale of a girl from another world who was fascinated with the human world. One day she escaped to our realm and forgot who she was. She eventually grew old and died, but her father the king spoke of her return, possibly in another body, and he would wait for her until his dying day. After this, we are properly introduced to Ophelia and her mother, who are on their way to stay with Captain Vidal, the mother's new husband. The mother notes that Ophelia has brought a great many books, considering they are headed for the country, and upon noticing that she is reading a fairy tale, she remarks that she's getting too old for that sort of thing. Suddenly the mother grows ill and insists that they stop the car. While she deals with her ailment, Ophelia notices a stone eye on the ground. Finding its match, she places the eye into a stone figure when out comes a large insect. When Ophelia returns, she reports her findings to her mother.
He visto nada.
Pero mira cómo te has puesto los zapatos. Vamos. Cuando lleguemos al molino, quiero que saludes al capitán. Y quiero que le llames padre. No sabes lo bueno que ha sido con nosotras, hija. Es una palabra, Ophelia. No es más que una palabra.
After this, they continue their way until arriving at Captain Vidal, who remarks impatiently that they have arrived 15 minutes late. He regards Ophelia's mother with kindness and patience, even insisting that she follow the doctor's orders and be taken in by wheelchair, as she is with child. But Ophelia he regards with passive disdain, becoming annoyed when she extends the wrong hand to shake. Ophelia is then left to her own devices, and notices the insect she encountered. She chases it all the way to a labyrinth, and we are then introduced to Mercedes, one of Captain Vidal's housekeepers. She explains to Ophelia that the labyrinth has been here longer than even the property that was built on the site. She advises that Ophelia not go playing around in it, or she may get lost. The two are then called to Captain Vidal, whom Ophelia still refuses to call father. Meanwhile, the captain sets back to work in his business. At this point, there is a group of resistance fighters hiding in the mountains, who still refuse to bow to the new regime, even though for all intents and purposes the war has already been lost for them. Captain Vidal begins a plan to drive them out of the mountains by hoarding all the food and medical supplies at his compound, forcing them to come to him. We are then introduced to Dr. Ferrero, who attends to Ophelia's sick mother. He treats them both with kindness and is called away by Mercedes. Then we are made aware that these two are actually members of the Resistance, or at the very least aiding them. The principal character traits of Mercedes and Dr. Ferrero are that of compassion, making them the antithesis of Captain Vidal, a fact that will be made more and more clear as the film goes on. As Ophelia and her mother prepare for bed, her mother tries to comfort her in this strange and new place. Ophelia cannot understand why her mother had to get married in the first place. The mother responds that she had simply been alone for too long. Ophelia counters by saying that she had always been with her and that she was never alone, but her mother assures her that she will understand when she's older. Suddenly, the baby begins having problems once more, and Ophelia's mother asks her to tell it a bedtime story, as it always seems to calm it down. Ophelia tells the unborn child a tale of a flower at the top of a mountain that gives eternal life, but that no man can reach. And it's in this moment that we get a look into what kind of a girl Ophelia is. She is a character of few words unless she is telling a story, and upon being asked to tell a story, she can recite one immediately off the top of her head. Even seeing an insect come out of a stone statue is interpreted by her as seeing a fairy. Fantasy is Ophelia's natural world. The real world is something that she doesn't seem to have settled into yet. Meanwhile, Dr. Ferrero reports to Captain Vidal that Ophelia's mother is well for the moment, but Vidal seems uninterested in this and instead asks about the health of the unborn child.
Mi hijo, ¿cómo está?
Por el momento no hay motivo de alarma.
Muy bien.
Capitán, su mujer no debió haber viajado en un estado tan avanzado de embarazo.
¿Esa es su opinión?
Mi opinión profesional, sí, señor.
Un hijo debe nacer donde quiera que esté su padre. Eso es todo.
Otra cosa, capitán. ¿Quién le ha dicho a usted que la criatura es un varón?
No me joda.
And now we understand why Ophelia's mother was the only person that Captain Vidal regarded with kindness and patience. It had nothing to do with her. She is simply the one carrying what he assumes is his unborn son. One wonders what kind of treatment she will receive after it is born. The captain is then informed of two suspicious individuals who were found in a vicinity where there was heard gunfire. Naturally, the captain is suspicious as they might be resistance fighters, but the two insist that they are simply farmers who were hunting rabbits. Each time they try to plead their case, the captain asserts his authority until things finally come to a head. A word of warning, the following scene is extremely graphic.
Yo subí al monte, capitán, para cazar conejos, para mis hijas que me se han puesto enfermas.
Conejos.
Capitán, si mi padre lo dice, cazaba conejos.
Me lo ha matado. Asesino, hijo de puta.
A ver si aprenden a registrar esta gentuza antes de venir a molestarme.
Sí, capitán.
I don't usually offer up warnings before a scene of violence, because in this day and age, the use of violence is only for the purposes of entertainment, or at least largely. Almost never am I bothered by violence in movies, even in movies that are 10 times as violent as the scene you've just witnessed. By the time this scene was over, I was shaking, because here again is an example of Del Toro viewing elements such as violence as a tool rather than as a frivolity. In this cruel, gruesome act of senseless violence, it is made absolutely clear what kind of man Captain Vidal is. And from this moment on, we will never again question what this man is capable of. As Ophelia sleeps, she is visited by the insect she encountered earlier. Asking if it's a fairy, she shows it a picture from her book, and the creature studies it and then morphs into the image that it sees. It then beckons Ophelia to follow it down through the labyrinth. Once there, she meets a creature of many names, but introduces itself as a faun. He explains that she is the lost princess from the story in the opening, that her father opened portals all over the world for her to return, and that this is the last of them. But in order to make sure she has not become fully mortal, she must complete 3 tasks before the moon is full, in order to return to their world.
Este es el libro de las encrucijadas. Cuando estéis sola, abridlo. Él os mostrará vuestro futuro. Os mostrará qué hacer.
Aquí no hay nada.
The next morning, Ophelia receives 2 things, a beautiful new dress made by her mother, and the first of her 3 tasks. She must travel to an old tree where a toad has lodged and prevented the tree from flourishing, and she must retrieve a key from its belly by putting 3 magic stones in its mouth. Meanwhile, Captain Vidal spots smoke rising from the woods and takes his men in search of the rebels. They arrive to find them gone, but the captain discovers a vial left behind of antibiotics. And so once again, the 2 worlds that this movie inhabits are separated. Del Toro shows us both worlds in contrast to one another. Ophelia, thus far, is the only character who has not participated in the real-world story. The war, the resistance, Captain Vidal, it all has nothing to do with her. In fact, she and Captain Vidal interact very little in this movie, and Vidal certainly has no place or purpose in the fantasy realm, at least not tangibly. Because of this, we are able to inspect both aspects of the film individually. And we come to discover that the only thing that both worlds have in common is that they are both very dangerous and very frightening. Both are uncharted realms for Ophelia, and in both, Ophelia has found a guide. In the fantasy world, it comes in the form of the faun, and in the real world, it has come in the form of Mercedes, who has given her compassion and advice since she arrived. But there is one distinct difference between Ophelia's experience in the real world and in the fantasy world. In the real world, she is helpless, subject to the whims of circumstance and the wills of others. Her mother gets married to a tyrant. She is forced to relocate against her will. She has no control and no recourse. And in the grand scheme of the real-world story, she is not even a very important person. But in the fantasy world, she is prepared. She has challenges to overcome here too, but here she is given many tools to overcome them. Tools to go along with her journey that do give her some measure of control in this world. She is even somewhat important in this world as she is a princess. These 2 contrasts give an indispensable insight into the nature of what is really going on here, which will play a significant part, at least for me, in what is revealed at the end of the film. Ophelia manages to retrieve the key from the toad through a measure of resourcefulness, but upon leaving the tree, she sees that her choice has come at a price. Her dress is now ruined. Captain Vidal then has guests come to his compound and orders that only 1 ration card be given to each family in the vicinity under his control, ensuring that no one is giving food to the rebels. Naturally, those rations are just barely enough to keep those families alive. When someone brings this to his attention, the captain ensures him that now more than ever, this is an excellent strategy in dealing with the rebels.
Están perdiendo terreno. Andan a cuestas al menos con un herido.
Con perdón, capitán. ¿Cómo está usted tan seguro?
Hoy casi los cogemos. Llevaban esto. Antibiótico.
A esa gente, Dios ya les ha salvado el alma. Lo que al cuerpo le suceda, bien poco le importa.
This brings to light just the terrible position that Mercedes and the doctor are in. Like Ophelia, the two have very little control in this world. Their friends are starving and injured. The captain is exploiting every weakness they have, and they must sit by and do nothing, or at the very least, very, very little. Unlike their brothers in arms, these two live in luxury under the aegis of the captain, given food and warm beds, while their comrades are cold and hungry. What they do by choice, and with every character's choice in this film will come a consequence. As the dinner goes on, Carmen, Ophelia's mother, tells the guests the story of how she and the captain came to be together. Her previous husband was a tailor who made the captain's uniforms, and when he died in the war, she went to work at the shop, and the two got to know each other from then on. But here for the first time, the captain openly grows impatient with Carmen's fondness over the story as she tells it to his guests.
Perdonen a mi mujer. No ha visto mucho mundo, ¿saben? Cree que a todos nos interesan estas tonterías.
So the captain insists that unlike Ophelia, he has no patience or stomach for fairy tales and love stories. But after this display of impatience, we are told a story involving the captain himself. Many scenes in the film thus far have seen him checking and repairing an old pocket watch, and now perhaps we come to discover why. A man at the table had apparently known Vidal's father, a soldier in another war, and he recounts a story that when his father died, he smashed his watch onto a rock so that his son would know the exact time of his death, and so that his son would know how a brave man dies. Several previous scenes have indicated that the captain already knows this story and lives by it to a certain extent, but when confronted on it in public, all he has to say is this.
Habladurías. Nunca tuvo un reloj.
Those who have no fantasies to escape to in this film have no recourse. They must sit by and watch events as they unfold, offering what little they can to the conclusions they desire. But Ophelia, who has her fantasy world, has something stable, something that is hers. It is a perilous and violent world just like the real world, but it is hers to hold on to in the storm. We now come to find that Vidal has something very similar, a fairy tale of his own that guides him on his way, and just like Ophelia, he keeps it hidden. It is the one thread that gives these two characters something in common. It is the one thing that gets them both through their worlds. When Ophelia returns, she is scolded by her mother and sent to bed without supper. Soon, however, she is visited by the insect and taken back to the labyrinth. She reports to the fawn that her mission was successful and is given new tools for her next task: a piece of magic chalk, an hourglass, and a few fairies. She is told to consult the book on what to do next, but when Ophelia opens the book again, all that is revealed is blood. And soon the reality of the situation plays out just as the book foretold. After her mother's complications, Mercedes comforts her. Ophelia reveals that she knows she is helping the men in the resistance, but has told no one. She wants nothing bad to happen to Mercedes, and Mercedes says the same of her in return. Finally, the two bond over a lullaby. Mercedes is a character that has gotten away from fairy stories and lullabies as she has grown older, but in Ophelia, she now revisits them and discovers that rather than something to be cast aside when you grow up, they may actually be more useful for adults than they are for children, especially when being confronted by dark times. Later that night, Mercedes and Dr. Ferrero decide to venture to the Resistance personally and offer whatever help they can. And when they arrive, we come to find out that Mercedes' brother is a prominent figure there. Our first look at the Resistance tells the whole story. Everyone is tired and war-torn, and one poor soul ends up losing his leg, with no anesthetic but a small bottle of alcohol. Meanwhile, Ophelia is visited by the fawn, who, for the first time, comes to her and scolds her for not carrying out the second task.
Habéis evitado la prueba.
No. Mi madre está enferma.
No es excusa para la negligencia. Mirad, esta es una mandrágora, una planta que soñaba con ser humana. Colocadla debajo de la cama de vuestra madre en un cuenco con leche fresca. Cada mañana, dadle de beber 2 gotas de sangre.
There are 2 points of interest here. The first is that the root she has been given is actually a lot like Ophelia herself. It is a magical creature who longs to be part of the human world, whereas Ophelia is a human who longs to be part of the magical world. The second is that up until this point, Ophelia had only been given tools to help her in the other world. This is the first time something has been put in place to change anything in the real world. Being given the root, Ophelia now has some measure of control over what happens in her world as well. Ophelia then sets out in her task with the items she has been given. The chalk, which can make a door to another realm wherever one is drawn. The hourglass, to keep time as she must return before the last grain falls, and the fairies to guide her through. Ophelia was told directly by the faun and by the book to expect a feast placed in a room with a creature, but not to eat or drink anything while she is there. She is even told that her very life depends on it. Ophelia arrives in the room and uses the key to unlock a particular safe, revealing a dagger. But before she leaves, she is tempted by the food on the table. Even despite the fairy's attempted intervention, she gives in to her greed and helps herself. This then awakens the Pale Man. This is the first time Ophelia has been directly threatened by one of the monsters in the fairy tale world, and it gives you pause to think about the contrast between the reality and the fantasy in this film. The Pale Man is one of the most unique-looking monsters I have ever seen, and though it is mute, its very form and presence is intimidating. Captain Vidal, on the other hand, has an almost generic appearance, yet it is Vidal who comes across far more threatening than any of the monsters in the fantasy world. And there's a reason why. For as scary and intimidating as the monsters in this fantasy are, they don't exist. And by that I mean that they do not exist in any reality. This is true of all fairy tale villains, like the Duke in Moulin Rouge. We know he is the villain because he has a snidely whiplash mustache and a somewhat bourgeois attitude. But there is nothing particularly real about him, any more than the villains in this fairy tale. People like the Duke exist only in the movies, and the monsters in this film exist only in fairy tales. But Vidal is different. We've seen the extent of his cruelness, his chauvinistic attitude towards women, and his inhumane tactics of war. Everything about Captain Vidal embodies the worst traits of humanity, but unlike the fairy tale villains, men like Captain Vidal have in fact lived and breathed in our own world. Captain Vidal is a monster, and these monsters do exist. As for Ophelia, her actions have cost the lives of one of the fairies, and now threatens her own life as well. The next day, Ophelia does as she was instructed with the mandrake root, and immediately upon placing it under her mother's bed, Dr. Ferrero reports that the mother's health is improving, though he doesn't know how or why. The captain informs him that if it comes down to saving one or the other, to save the child, so that the male may live and carry on his family name. When the two leave the room, Ophelia makes one desperate plea to the unborn child.
Hermano. Hermano. Si me escuchas, las cosas por aquí no están muy bien. Pero ya pronto tendrás que salir. Has puesto muy mal a mamá. Cuando salgas, quiero pedirte una cosa. Solo una. Que no le hagas daño a mamá. Ya la conocerás. Es muy bonita. Aunque a veces esté triste muchos días. Pero ya la verás cuando sonríe. Te va a gustar mucho. Escucha. Si me obedeces, te prometo una cosa. Te llevaré a mi reino y serás un príncipe. Te lo prometo. Un príncipe.
The scene shows just how deep Ophelia has gotten into the fantasy world. Her dependence on the fantasies have grown from an occasional diversion to a complete dependence at this point, and it has become the go-to solution for every problem for her. The world of the Faun has gone from being an escape from the real world to an escape from a nightmare. And as things get worse and worse in Ophelia's reality, the fantasy world has been emerging more and more. This again is a very important detail when it comes to the end of the film. After this, the rebels create a diversion in the mountains to lure the captain and his men away so that they can steal the guarded supplies. This leads to a confrontation where once again the captain's cruelty is demonstrated, and a rebel is in fact captured. Around this time in the film is where the consequences of everyone's choices begin to emerge, and now more than ever, very difficult decisions need to be made. The poor soul who was captured is taken to the storeroom to be tortured for information by Captain Vidal, and we've seen what he does to farmers who hunt rabbits. Mercedes and Dr. Ferrero now must decide if they will continue their cover or try to help the poor man. Mercedes has already expressed a regret for not being able to do more for her friends and allies, but interestingly enough, she chooses to remain silent. It is actually the doctor, the most reluctant of the two, who will eventually decide to intervene. The prisoner is taken through exactly what will happen to him step by step, tool by tool. I honestly didn't think that the captain could come across any more cruel or threatening after the bottle scene, but Del Toro escalates his viciousness in perfect measure. We're seeing two different sides of the captain's cruelty, with the tools he uses being almost a physical example of them. In the scene with the farmers, his approach to violence was direct and blunt, and what was used for that violence was a very blunt instrument. When forced to use finesse, however, his approach is far more methodical, with more methodical tools being used. The difference, however, is that in the case of strictly blunt force, the deed was quick. This will not be. As Ophelia sleeps that night, the Faun comes to visit her once again, and while Ophelia reports that the mission was a success, she also confesses that things went somewhat wrong.
Sucedió un accidente.
Un accidente.
Sí.
¡Habéis roto las reglas!
Eran solo 2 uvas. Yo creí que nadie se daría cuenta.
¡Ah! Nos hemos equivocado.
Equivocado.
¡Habéis fallado! ¡No podéis regresar!
Fue todo un accidente.
¡No podéis regresar! La luna estará llena en 3 días. Vuestro espíritu se quedará para siempre entre los hombres. Envejeceréis con ellos, moriréis como ellos. Vuestra memoria se desvanecerá en el tiempo y nosotros desapareceremos con ella. No nos volveréis a ver jamás.
Ophelia has therefore received the consequences of her own choice, and it is a devastating one. Her one and only refuge from the horrors of her life have now been completely cut off. The fairy tale world has forsaken her, and what's worse is that the mandrake root seems to have stopped working as well. And when it's discovered by Captain Vidal, everything falls apart for poor Ophelia. Her mother tells her that fairy tales don't exist, that the world is a cruel and unfair place, and the sooner she learns that, the better. At this point, Ophelia simply has nowhere to turn. The fairy tale world has abandoned her, and those in the real world try to take it away from her for good as well. And it's at this point of the film where you start to see Del Toro's strategy in telling this story. Although the fairy tale world and the real world are separated in the film, nothing good has happened in either of them. Everything that has taken place has either been an act of cruelty or a tool to try and take these characters away from that cruelty. Some of them choose to hide, some of them choose to accept their own demons, but everyone in this film is under constant duress from the horrors of their own worlds. Meanwhile, Dr. Ferrero is called by Captain Vidal to treat the prisoner. The poor man reveals that he did talk. Not very much, but he did reveal that there was an informant in the compound. The man then begs for the doctor to kill him, and knowing what it will cost him, Dr. Ferrero does so without hesitation. When confronted on this by Captain Vidal, the doctor explains why he did what he did, and his words will tie in heavily with the remaining issues of the film.
No lo entiendo. ¿Por qué no me obedeció?
Es que obedecer por obedecer, así, sin pensarlo, eso solo lo hacen gentes como usted, capitán.
This is perhaps a slightly strange comment, but the Doctor's death scene is one of the best death scenes that I have ever seen, and it shows the consistent technique Del Toro is using in this film. Everything is real. Even the fantasy world echoes of the real violence and cruelty of the real world. And here, the death of a hero is portrayed in a way that is not the slightest bit dramatic, not celebrated or glorified in any way. Dr. Ferrero dies a simple death, and when having been shot, he simply continues to walk, even removing his glasses, as if to try and resort to something normal, something steady to help him get through the horror of what is really happening to him. Dr. Ferrero's sacrifice, above all else, was the most heroic act of the entire film. But it will not be the last time a sacrifice will be made here. It seems that Captain Vidal has chosen the wrong time to kill his doctor, however, because Ophelia's mother then begins to give a very complicated birth. And interestingly enough, her problems start to emerge immediately after the mandrake root was burned. Everyone takes care of her as best they can, and they manage to save the boy. Sadly, Carmen did not survive. Ophelia is now left with nothing. She has no mother, no home, and nowhere to turn. All of the events in the film are about to lead up to a final resolution, most particularly for two specific instances. We've seen that Captain Vidal has a story in his life that keeps as the center of everything that he does. The story of the Watch, a story of bravery and of how a man dies. It is a tale and tradition that he wants for his new son, and it seems as if he will be achieving that goal. Ophelia, on the other hand, has her own fairy tale, but has lost it, and it seems that it may be gone forever. Having nowhere else to run, she looks to Mercedes, who attempts to flee after it has been discovered that she may be the informant, but the two are discovered and Mercedes is taken captive. She eventually overcomes Vidal and flees, later to be rescued by the Resistance, who now outnumber Vidal's forces by about 3-1 and plan to take over the compound. And just when things look their grimmest, when all hope seems to have been taken away, the fawn returns to Ophelia.
He decidido daros otra oportunidad. Prometéis obedecerme. Haréis todo lo que yo os diga, sin cuestionarlo. Es vuestra última oportunidad. Entonces, escuchadme bien.
This request from the fawn ties in directly with the reality aspect of the film. Obeying without question is the very thing Ferrero refused to do during his final act of heroism. It therefore seems that what Ophelia is supposed to do may not necessarily be the right thing to do. To re-enter the kingdom may mean becoming much more like Captain Vidal, but to stay on the right path could mean doing the right thing and suffering the consequences for it as Ferrero did. Ophelia is told to bring the baby to the labyrinth, and she is given the magic chalk so as to create a door to Vidal's room. As the compound is attacked by the resistance, Ophelia manages to drug the captain and escape with the child. After a brief chase, we are finally led to the labyrinth, and to the conclusion for all of these people's stories. And everything we thought we knew up to this point is suddenly cast into a very different light.
El portal solo se abrirá si derramamos en él sangre inocente. Solo un poco de sangre. Un pinchazo tan solo es la última prueba. Vamos.
Prometisteis obedecerme sin chistar. Entregadme al niño.
No. Mi hermano se queda conmigo.
¿Sacrificaréis vuestro derecho sagrado por este mocoso al que apenas conocéis?
Sí. Lo sacrifico.
¿Negaréis vuestra cuna por él? ¿Él por quien habéis sido humillada e ignorada?
Sí. La niego.
Hágase pues vuestra voluntad, Alteza.
The captain takes his son back and delivers a fatal shot to Ophelia. With Ophelia slowly dying, Vidal emerges to find his compound overrun. Knowing what his fate will now be, Vidal asks that the boy be told the minute that he died, so as to preserve the one fairy tale that guided him all his life. But Mercedes refuses, saying that the boy will never even know he existed. And with that, Vidal meets his fate, with no watch to guide him this time. As for Ophelia, as the life slips from her body, she awakens in the other world.
Poneos de pie, hija mía. Acercaos.
Padre.
Habéis derramado vuestra sangre antes que la de un inocente. Esa era la última prueba, la más importante. Y habéis elegido bien, Alteza.
Venid a mi lado y sentaos junto a vuestro padre, que tan largo tiempo os ha esperado.
Captain Vidal did not get to keep his fairy tale, but Ophelia earns hers. And so here again we are given a happy ending and a sad ending at the same time. As she dies, Mercedes hums the lullaby that they had bonded over, and though Ophelia leaves our world, she is given, at least to some degree, eternal happiness and life in the kingdom forever. Or so it seems. One of the reasons I started doing Matthew's favorite movies is because while I've done a lot of negative reviews about aspects of certain films that I don't like, I realized that I never really gave you guys anything to compare that to. And since a lot of movies that I love have many things in common with the movies that I don't, people naturally started getting very confused. Why Moulin Rouge and not Titanic, as they're strikingly similar? Why Pan's Labyrinth and not 2001: A Space Odyssey, since they're both largely interpretive? Giving people an idea of my standards only in the negative completes a mere half of the picture, so hopefully this series will fill in the other half, and as far as I'm concerned, there are very few films better than Pan's Labyrinth for an example of what I look for in a film. Guillermo del Toro has made good movies as well as some very bad ones, but he has said on several occasions that Pan's Labyrinth is his favorite one to date. As well he should, and he should be very proud of himself. He has taken the idea of a fairy tale contrasted with reality and made it into a film that can hold its own against some of the greatest films ever made. In this film, Del Toro makes the most of every tool he has, and he uses them all in exactly the right ways. Every element in the film is in place to enhance the story, right down to the very look of the film. The architecture and color scheme of the real world used straight and diagonal lines and colors of a cool blue and black, and to contrast, the fantasy world was a world of rounded architecture and colors of red and gold. The architecture of the captain's dining room mirrors the architecture of the room of the Pale Man. Now, all of these things give visual cues to engage the audience in where they are and in what everything is and represents. This is not just to make the movie look pretty or give it its own sense of style. It is an extra dimension that brings out the substance of the setting and the story.
Nosotros le asistiremos en todo lo que necesite, capitán. Sabemos que no está aquí por gusto.
En eso se equivoca. Yo estoy aquí porque quiero que mi hijo nazca en una España limpia y nueva. Porque esta gente parte de una idea equivocada, que somos todos iguales. Pero hay una gran diferencia, que la guerra terminó y ganamos nosotros. Y si para que nos enteremos todos hay que matar a esos hijos de puta, pues los matamos. Y ya está. Todos estamos aquí por gusto.
Por gusto.
Por gusto.
Choice is the central issue in this film, and the choices people make define who they are and what they achieve in the end. Pan's Labyrinth is a film that recognizes the reality of the world, its lack of fairness and its acts of cruelty, but it also embraces fantasies and dreams. Yes, there are bad things happening in this film. Most of the events in the film were horrific, but the one thing no character in this film ever resorted to was despair. A glimmer of hope shines very dim throughout all the horrors of the film, but even the dimmest light is leading these people through the dark. What this movie ultimately tells us is that fantasies and fairy tales are some of the most important human tools we have, not only to stimulate the imagination, but to get us through the hard times. And this story comes through on every aesthetic, storytelling, and artistic level. And even though this is a foreign film, I can say that without fear of misrepresenting the work. Foreign films are things that I usually try to stay away from, and a lot of people seem to think that this is disrespectful to the work, but I actually see it as being kind of the opposite. When you dub a film or subtitle a film, you are in fact changing what the writer wrote in the first place. The gist may be the same, but the flow, meter, and sometimes even the context is completely different. For me, this would be like another director reshooting a film for another audience and showing it as a representation of the original director's work. And so my apprehension in approaching foreign films is actually more out of respect for the writer than anything else. For me, if I'm going to see a movie in another language, I would honestly like to learn the language before I do, a feat that sadly I have yet to master. Now, I know that may seem a little extreme, and maybe it is better to just see the gist of someone's work than miss it completely, but surprisingly, Del Toro himself seems to have shared my sentiments in one case. When he saw the subtitled version of one of his own films, he was appalled. He actually referred to the translation as being for the thinking impaired. It makes me wonder how other filmmakers feel about the subtitling of their own films, or even if they think about it at all. So what makes Pan's Labyrinth different? Well, once again, this is a case of Del Toro going the extra mile for his art. Del Toro decided not to have another thinking impaired repeat and painstakingly wrote the English subtitles for Pan's Labyrinth personally. As he speaks both languages, he was able to give the best translation possible for his own work. And in my view, this pays off better than any foreign film I've seen, because the translation was so natural that by the time I had seen this movie the first time, I didn't even remember it being subtitled. I'm not sure how this film would come across in any other language, other than English or Spanish, but I was able to grasp exactly what the writer had in mind, this time in his own words. Now, as many of you are already aware, interpretive films typically do nothing but piss me off, because it's all too easy in most cases for the writer to hand the reins of meaning over to the audience without doing any real work themselves. People who typically make these kinds of works actually find value in there being nothing to understand in the first place. as if other people making up meanings means that they, the artist, are somehow talented. TVTropes.org has a section entitled True Art is Incomprehensible, and someone listed it on my TV Tropes page as being my single biggest pet peeve. Very accurately, I might add. The first quote on that page reads as follows from an anonymous artist. I shudder to think if the majority of people look at my brushwork and say it is pretty, for then I know it is ordinary and I have failed. If they say that they do not understand it, or even that it is ugly, I am happy, for I have succeeded. These are the kinds of dimwits that I think need to go sit in the corner with a dunce cap on so they can stop wasting our time and give real artists a chance to express their work. True art matters to the artist. True artists understand their own art. And if you don't know what your art means, then how the fuck am I supposed to know? In the case of 2001, the whatever it was at the end of the film could have been anything. It could have been created for any reason, because we are never told what the monoliths are, or what they want, or why they're doing anything that they're doing. You can use things in the movie to fashion your own meaning, but each meaning you make up stands in the exact same relation to someone else's because it's pure personal speculation. Like looking at a Rorschach test. This is no more or less a bunny than it is a pony, because in reality, it's neither. It's just a big blob of ink. And actually writing 2001 required no more effort or talent than squirting a blob of ink onto a blank page. But Pan's Labyrinth pulls off something of a minor miracle for me. It delivers an ending that is ambiguous, and it does it in a way that actually works. Like 2001, there is no one set right or wrong answer to what the ending means, but that doesn't mean that it's all off in the clouds somewhere. While there may not be one definitive meaning to the ending, there are only one of two things that the ending can mean. Either the fairy tale world really existed and everything played out exactly as Ophelia believed, or it was all in her mind. That's it. Neither conclusions are absolute, but it is either one or the other, and there is evidence to support both. It's difficult to explain how Ophelia would have escaped her room and gotten into the captain's room if not for the magic chalk being real. Also, everything she was given in that world, such as the chalk and the mandrake root, had to come from somewhere. The book she was given seemed to do a pretty good job of accurately predicting future events, and the mandrake root did seem to work exactly as the fawn said it would. But even with all these supporting arguments, I think a stronger case can be made for the conclusion that it was all in her mind. And since I am being encouraged to give an interpretation of my own, here's why. For one thing, Ophelia was already prone to fairy tales in the first place, and it seems a bit convenient that one would just happen to find her. Also, the tales in the magic world of the frog, the pale man, and so forth were very similar in theme and in meter to the story she made up about the flower on the hill, which says to me that this is more to do with what's going on in her subconscious than anything that was happening in reality. Also, every time something magical happened, she was alone, except for when the mandrake root was burned, and when this happened, the mother didn't even seem to notice it shrieking at all. True, it would have been difficult for Ophelia to get in and out of the rooms without the chalk, but since it all happened off-camera, we don't know, and it certainly wouldn't have been impossible. After all, we actually saw her go through the magic door every time except that one. And sure, the mandrake root did seem to work immediately after she did what she was told, but then maybe it was just a coincidence. I mean, bizarre coincidences do happen. As you can see, there are plenty of pro and con arguments that can be made about all of this, and these things can be safely debated in an atmosphere where someone's interpretation can be interesting without necessarily being right or wrong, but this is ultimately what I take away from the film. I believe the fairy tale ending was simply the last thing that passed through Ophelia's mind before she died. Whether the fairy tale world was real or just real for her, it was the thing that ultimately saved her, spiritually if not physically. Which still makes for a very beautiful ending. All we as human beings can do is hope that when we go, we are as comforted and as at peace as Ophelia was in her time. And granted, that position is interpretive, but this is one of those rare instances where I'm actually okay with that, because the interpretive side of the film actually works. Now, oftentimes, interpretation either has nothing to do with the actual film that's being interpreted, or it simply doesn't end up amounting to very much in the first place. Look at Donnie Darko. The reason Donnie Darko was good was because of its characters and its exploration of our fears and simplistic ways of looking at the big problems in life. The paradox making sense at the end doesn't really have anything to do with those aspects of the film, so whether the ending makes sense or not doesn't affect how good the film was at all. What makes Pan's Labyrinth special is that the film works either way. No matter which interpretation you arrive at, the story works equally well, and it doesn't change what the core of the film was at all. I've never really seen that happen before, which is what makes Pan's Labyrinth such a special film for me. When Pan's Labyrinth was over, I was crying. I wasn't just crying because the girl was dead. I was crying because the film was so beautiful. Beautiful in its look, in its approach to the subject matter, and in its remarkable storytelling. I've often given certain rhetorical titles to films. The worst movie I've ever seen in my life, the best movie I've ever seen in my life, even the stupidest movie I have ever seen in my life. But you can quote me on this. Pan's Labyrinth is the most beautiful movie that I have ever seen in my life.